Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that would make your worst airplane middle seat experience look like first-class luxury. A Viking slave ship. One night aboard these floating nightmares would have you begging to go back to your annoying coworker Zoom calls and pretending to care about their weekend stories. So before you get comfortable in your climate-controlled room with running water, Wi-Fi, and the revolutionary concept of personal space, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially when we're about to discuss a time when international travel involved significantly more chains and significantly less customer service. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Trust me, after this, you'll never complain about airplane food again. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Viking slave ships. Most people picture some romanticized scene from a Hollywood movie. Maybe rough but manageable, like a really bad camping trip with bearded men who occasionally break into song about the glory of Valhalla. You know, the kind of thing where everyone's dirty but somehow still photogenic. And the biggest problem is that the mead runs out. In reality, these vessels were floating concentration camps designed to transport human cargo with all the comfort and humanity of a medieval garbage disposal unit operated by people who thought customer satisfaction was a sign of weakness. This wasn't some adventurous voyage with horn-helmeted warriors sharing stories around a cozy fire while their captives sat nearby looking mildly inconvenienced. It was a carefully orchestrated system of human trafficking that would make modern cruise ship complaints about buffet lines and Wi-Fi connectivity look absolutely ridiculous. The Vikings didn't hold focus groups asking, how can we make this journey more pleasant for our involuntary passengers? They were thinking, how many bodies can we cram into this wooden box while keeping them alive enough to sell at the other end? And what's the minimum amount of food we can give them without having them die before we reach the slave market? Think of it this way. Imagine being crammed into a subway car during rush hour in New York City, except the subway car is made of wood that's constantly creaking and probably leaking. It's constantly rocking back and forth like a theme park ride. Designed by someone who hates fun. There's no air conditioning, no windows you can open, no bathroom breaks, no escape routes, and everyone around you is either seasick, terrified, or both. Oh, and the trip doesn't last 30 minutes. It lasts for weeks or even months, depending on weather conditions and how many stops your captors want to make along the way to pick up more human cargo. It's like comparing a luxury hotel experience to being shipped in a container, except the container is floating, actively leaking seawater, smells like a combination of unwashed bodies and medieval bathroom facilities, and is full of people who definitely don't want to be there and are making their feelings about the situation very clear through constant weeping, praying, or plotting escape attempts that everyone knows are hopeless. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, was like the medieval equivalent of a really aggressive expansion pack for European civilization, except instead of adding new features and improvements, it mostly added terror, kidnapping, and a thriving human trafficking industry. Scandinavia wasn't some frozen wasteland populated by noble warriors, seeking glorious death in battle while composing epic poetry about honor and destiny. It was a collection of kingdoms desperately trying to figure out how to make money in a world where your main natural resources were fish, furs, really cold weather, and an unfortunate tendency towards seasonal depression. The Norse controlled the seas like Amazon controls your shopping habits and delivery expectations. And just like modern logistics companies, they realized that human trafficking was unfortunately very profitable and had excellent scalability potential. The Arabic silver that flowed into Norse lands didn't come from Vikings selling handcrafted jewelry on some medieval version of Etsy, or from their revolutionary advances in fish preservation technology. It came from a brutal trade network that stretched from Ireland to Constantinople, with human beings serving as the primary commodity, the most reliable export, and the foundation of their entire economic system. If you thought medieval Scandinavia was all about epic battles between honorable warriors following strict codes of conduct, think again. It was primarily about business economics, and slaves were literally currency. They had exchange rates, market fluctuations, and probably the medieval equivalent of quarterly earnings reports. These weren't occasional raids undertaken for personal glory or to prove one's worthiness to the gods. This was systematic, organized business with supply chains, distribution networks, and customer bases that would make modern corporations envious of their market penetration. The geography made it perfect for this horrible enterprise, like nature had designed the region specifically for maritime human trafficking. Scandinavia's countless fjords and islands were like natural highways for raiders, a perfect network of hidden bases and escape routes, while the rest of Europe was still figuring out basic concepts like maybe we should defend our coastlines, and perhaps having no military presence near valuable monasteries full of defenseless monks isn't the best strategic decision. It's like having a motorcycle in a world of pedestrians. You can get anywhere fast, grab whatever you want, and disappear before anyone figures out what happened or manages to organize a response. But here's where it gets really dark. And, darker than a Norwegian winter. This wasn't just random violence perpetrated by chaotic barbarians having bad days. The slave trade was so central to Viking society that they had developed specific terminology for different types of slaves, established regular trade routes with scheduled stocks, and even organized slave markets that operated with the efficiency of modern farmers' markets, except instead of selling organic vegetables and artisanal bread, they were selling people. The economic structure of Viking society literally depended on this human trafficking system, which makes those romanticized portrayals in popular culture feel pretty uncomfortable when you actually know the historical reality. Take Ahmad Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Viking slave traders in 922 CE along the Volga River. His detailed account reads like a horror movie script written by someone who clearly wished they'd called in sick that day and stayed home with a good book instead of embarking on what turned out to be the diplomatic mission from hell. But Ahmad wasn't just some random observer wandering around medieval Europe with nothing better to do. He was a sophisticated diplomat from the Abbasid Caliphate, accustomed to luxury, civilization, and the basic concept that humans should treat other humans with some degree of dignity. Meeting these Norse traders was like a modern UN diplomat accidentally ending up at a medieval horror convention, run by people who thought the Geneva Convention was probably some kind of fancy cheese. Ahmad described the Vikings as the filthiest of all his creatures. And remember, this guy lived in an era before deodorant, daily bathing, or basic dental hygiene had been invented. So that's really saying something about their personal grooming standards. He wrote extensively about their complete disregard for what most civilizations considered basic hygiene, their casual attitude toward violence that would make modern action movie heroes look like pacifist philosophers, and most disturbing of all, their treatment of slaves, which he documented with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing something so terrible that he couldn't look away. According to Ahmad's account, the Vikings he encountered would purchase slave girls, use them however they pleased without any consideration for consent or basic human dignity, then sacrifice them at funeral ceremonies as if they were disposing of used goods. It's like combining human trafficking with religious extremism and calling it a normal Tuesday business meeting. The casual way they discussed this, according to Ahmed, suggested it wasn't considered unusual or morally questionable. It was just standard operating procedure. But here's the twist that makes this even more unsettling and psychologically disturbing. Ahmad wasn't just horrified by the Vikings' barbarity and complete lack of what he considered basic moral standards. He was also genuinely fascinated by their efficiency, organization, and business acumen. These weren't chaotic savages stumbling around Europe causing random destruction like some kind of medieval flash mob gone wrong. They were organized, systematic, and terrifyingly effective at what they did, with all the efficiency of a modern corporation and none of the legal restrictions. Ahmad noted their sophisticated understanding of international trade routes, their detailed knowledge of different markets and what sold well where, their ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances without modern communication technology, and their impressive logistics capabilities. It's like discovering that your local gang of street thugs is actually the front office for a multinational corporation with quarterly profit targets and employee performance reviews. The specific example that really drives home the horror of this situation is Ahmad's description of a slave ship he witnessed during his travels. He wrote about dozens of people chained together in the ship's hold like cargo, the overwhelming stench that could be detected from hundreds of meters away. And this is coming from someone living in an era before sewage treatment plants, and the casual way the Vikings discussed their human cargo like livestock inventory. One Viking trader apparently told him that a healthy young woman was worth approximately the same as 8 silver coins, about the price of a decent sword or really nice horse. Imagine reducing a human being's entire existence to the monetary value of a kitchen appliance, then having to live in a confined space with that person for weeks while they're understandably terrified, angry, and probably plotting your death. The modern parallel would be like someone today casually discussing their human trafficking operation while showing you their quarterly profit reports and asking if you'd like to invest in their expanding business model. This wasn't just about individual suffering, though that was certainly horrific enough to haunt anyone's nightmares for decades. The Viking slave trade was actively reshaping the entire medieval world in ways that most people today don't realize, and frankly, probably don't want to think about too deeply. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions over the course of several centuries, being forcibly relocated across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, in what amounted to the world's most brutal relocation program. It's like if someone was running a massive human trafficking operation that affected multiple continents for centuries, except there were no international laws, no human rights organizations, and no one keeping track of the victims except as inventory numbers. The economic impact was absolutely staggering in its scope and long-term consequences. Entire regions were systematically depopulated by repeated slave raids, their populations literally disappearing into the Viking trade network, while other areas saw their demographics artificially inflated by the constant arrival of enslaved people from distant lands. The genetic and cultural mixing that resulted from this massive forced migration literally changed the DNA composition of European populations in ways that geneticists are still studying today. Some historians argue that the Viking slave trade was one of the most significant forced migration events in all of human history, right up there with the Atlantic slave trade that wouldn't happen for another 500 years. But here's what makes the situation even more complex and morally ambiguous. The enslaved people weren't just passive victims in the system. Some eventually became warriors themselves. Some became successful merchants. Some even became rulers in their new lands after proving their worth through various means. The system was so brutal and chaotic that it accidentally created opportunities for social mobility that didn't exist in the more rigid, traditional class structures of medieval European society. It's like the world's worst and most dangerous social networking system, where your professional connections were literally forged in chains and your networking events involved being sold in markets thought the stakes weren't just about personal survival. In horrible conditions, they were about the fundamental structure of medieval society. The development of international trade networks that would eventually shape the modern world economy, and the creation of cultural exchanges that happened at the point of a sword rather than through diplomatic negotiations or peaceful commerce. But Ahmad ibn Fedlan's horrified observations and diplomatic reports were just the beginning of understanding this systematized nightmare. The actual lived experience of being trapped inside one of these ships was something that would have broken most people's minds long before their bodies finally gave out from the physical stress and deprivation. The conditions were designed not for comfort, basic dignity, or even minimal human decency, but for maximum profit per square foot of available ship space, with all the compassion and humanitarian concern of a medieval Amazon warehouse. We're about to explore what it was actually like inside these floating prisons, and I promise you, it's going to make your worst travel experience, whether that's being stuck in an airport during holiday delays, enduring a cross-country bus trip with broken air conditioning, or surviving a budget airline flight with crying babies and no legroom. Look like a luxury vacation at a 5-star resort. The next time you find yourself complaining about airline food quality, cramped seating arrangements, or inadequate bathroom facilities, remember what we're about to discuss in horrifying detail. These ships were designed by people who had solved the complex logistics problem of human transportation with all the compassion and concern for passenger comfort of a medieval shipping company, except the packages they were delivering were people. And the final delivery destination was a slave market where those people would be sold to the highest bidder. The real question isn't whether you would survive one night on a Viking slave ship. It's whether you'd want to survive it. The living conditions aboard Viking slave ships make modern prison cells look like luxury hotel suites with room service and complimentary Wi-Fi. Unlike the spacious longships you see in movies, where warriors have enough room to row dramatically while their hair flows majestically in the sea breeze, slave ships were designed with one guiding principle in mind: maximize human cargo while minimizing every conceivable comfort or basic necessity. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of airline economics, except instead of trying to fit more passengers into coach class while charging extra for peanuts, they were trying to cram more humans into what was essentially a floating wooden coffin. With all the amenities of a medieval garbage dump, the average Viking slave ship was maybe 60 feet long and 15 feet wide, roughly the size of a small modern house, but designed to hold anywhere from 50 to 200 people depending on how creative the Vikings were feeling about human geometry that particular day. Do the math, and you're looking at about as much personal space as an actual coffin. Except coffins are designed for people who no longer need to breathe, eat, or complain about the accommodations. The ship's designers weren't thinking about comfort, ventilation, privacy, or basic human dignity, concepts that apparently hadn't made it onto their priority list. They were thinking about profit margins and inventory management, where the inventory happened to be people who had opinions about their situation and weren't shy about expressing them. Here's the thing that makes this even more horrifying from a logistics perspective. These weren't purpose-built slave ships, like the specialized vessels used in the Atlantic slave trade centuries later. Those later ships were at least designed specifically for human cargo transport, with some consideration for keeping people alive during the journey. Viking slave ships were regular longships that had been hastily modified for human cargo transport, with all the careful planning of a college student rearranging furniture in a dorm room. It's like taking a pickup truck and trying to use it as a passenger bus for a cross-country trip. Except the passengers are chained together. Definitely don't want to be there. And you're planning to sell them when you reach your destination. Modifications were brutally practical and showed all the creativity of someone solving a storage problem rather than designing living space for humans. Remove anything that wasn't absolutely essential for keeping the ship floating and moving. Add chains and restraints with the enthusiasm of someone who really enjoyed metalworking projects. And pack in as many bodies as physically possible while still maintaining the bare minimum conditions necessary to keep them breathing until sail time. Take the ship excavated near Skuldelv in Denmark. Archaeological evidence shows us exactly how these modifications worked, and it's like reading the instruction manual for a medieval torture device disguised as transportation. The original rowing benches, which had provided some semblance of personal space and comfort for actual Viking crew members, were completely removed and replaced with a series of wooden platforms that were barely wide enough for a person to lie down flat. These platforms were stacked in tiers like medieval bunk beds designed by someone who actively hated the concept of sleeping comfort and thought personal space was a character flaw. The space between levels was so narrow that sitting up straight was physically impossible. We're talking about maybe 18 inches of clearance, which means you could lie flat or you could curl up in the fetal position. But standing or even sitting normally was out of the question. Imagine trying to sleep in a space that's simultaneously too short to stretch out, too narrow to roll over, and too low to sit up, while the entire structure rocks back and forth continuously like a theme park ride designed by someone who thought motion sickness was hilarious. One surviving account from a Frankish monk named Ansgar, who was captured during a raid and later freed in a prisoner exchange, describes the sleeping arrangements as worse than being buried alive, because at least in a grave, you have the dignity of being alone with your thoughts. The slaves were chained together in groups of 4 to 6 people, which meant that if one person needed to move, stretch, or deal with a cramp, everyone in the chain had to coordinate their movements like the world's worst trust exercise conducted in a space the size of a closet. Personal space literally didn't exist as a concept. You were physically connected to strangers who were just as miserable, scared, and probably sick as you were. Privacy was impossible, dignity was non-existent, and the psychological pressure of being constantly pressed against other human bodies, while having no control over your situation, would have driven most people to complete mental breakdown within days. The bathroom situation was exactly as horrific as you'd expect from people who clearly hadn't consulted any experts in human waste management or basic sanitation. There were no toilets, no privacy screens, no designated bathroom areas, and absolutely no dignity whatsoever. Slaves were given specific time slots when they could relieve themselves over the side of the ship, but only if weather conditions allowed it, and only if the Vikings felt like accommodating such requests. During storms or rough seas, when going to the ship's edge would mean probable death, people just had to hold it indefinitely or deal with the inevitable consequences in a space they shared with dozens of other people. Let's be honest about what this means. During bad weather, which was frequent in the North Atlantic, the lower levels of the ship became a medieval sewage system with no drainage, no cleaning, and no escape. It's like the worst music festival bathroom situation you can imagine, except it lasts for weeks. You can't leave, and you have to sleep in it. Food distribution happened once a day if the slaves were lucky, usually consisting of a thin gruel made from whatever grain was cheapest and least appealing, combined with some kind of preserved fish that was probably questionable even by medieval standards of food safety. The portions were carefully calculated to keep people alive and functioning, but definitely not satisfied or comfortable. One account mentions that the daily ration was roughly equivalent to what a modern person might consider a light breakfast, except that meager portion was all you got for the entire 24-hour period. Water was strictly rationed and often contaminated from being stored in wooden barrels for weeks at a time, leading to widespread dysentery among the captives, which made the already nightmarish bathroom situation exponentially worse. The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical conditions, if such a comparison is even possible. These weren't prisoners of war who might expect eventual freedom through prisoner exchanges or ransom payments. These were people who had been violently ripped away from their families, their homes, their entire lives, and were being transported like livestock to be sold in foreign markets to strangers who would own them completely. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing about Viking society ever was, and the contradictions in their treatment of slaves would make your head spin faster than a carnival ride operated by drunk teenagers. The same culture that treated enslaved people like inventory in a warehouse also had surprisingly complex laws and social customs about slave treatment and ownership rights. Some Viking ship captains actually took measurably better care of their human cargo than others, not out of any sudden attack of conscience or humanitarian awakening, but because healthy, undamaged slaves commanded significantly higher prices at market. It's like the difference between a used car dealer who maintains his inventory with regular oil changes and car washes versus one who just tries to move damaged goods as quickly as possible before buyers notice the problems. There were also practical complications that made the entire situation even more unpredictable and psychologically destabilizing for everyone involved. During severe storms, when the ship was in genuine danger of sinking and taking everyone aboard to the bottom of the ocean, the normal social hierarchy temporarily collapsed out of pure survival necessity. Seasickness, terror, and the immediate threat of death didn't discriminate based on social status, and a ship full of vomiting, panicked people, both free Vikings and enslaved captives, was genuinely dangerous for everyone's survival chances. Some accounts describe Viking captains actually releasing slaves from their chains during the worst storms, not out of any sudden burst of mercy or recognition of shared humanity, but because groups of panicked, chained people could potentially capsize the entire vessel if they all rushed to one side in terror. It's like a twisted version of airline safety procedures, where the crew temporarily treats everyone equally because mutual survival depends on it, but only until the immediate crisis passes. The contradictions get even weirder and more psychologically complex when you consider that some Vikings actually developed what could be called genuine relationships with individual slaves during these extended voyages. Not romantic relationships. Let's be absolutely clear about that distinction, that the kind of psychological bonds and mutual dependence that form between people trapped in extreme survival situations together. Some slaves earned their freedom after proving themselves valuable during crises. Others were eventually adopted into Viking families after demonstrating loyalty or useful skills, and a few even became raiders themselves, joining the very system that had once enslaved them. This created an absolutely bizarre social dynamic where your fellow passengers might simultaneously include people who were planning to sell you at the next port, people who were in exactly the same terrifying situation as you, and people who had been enslaved themselves, but were now part of the Viking crew through various paths to freedom or acceptance. Imagine trying to navigate those complex social relationships and figure out who might help you versus who might betray you, all while chained in a space the size of a closet during a month-long ocean voyage where everyone's survival depended on cooperation, but the ultimate goal was your sail into permanent bondage. The result was essentially a floating, psychological experiment in human endurance that usually ended badly for everyone involved, including the Vikings who had to live and work in these conditions while managing increasingly desperate and potentially violent human cargo. The mortality rate on slave ships was absolutely staggering. Historical estimates suggest that anywhere from 20% to 50% of enslaved people died during transport, depending on the length of the voyage, weather conditions, and how much the Viking crew cared about maintaining their inventory in sellable condition. But here's what makes the numbers even more disturbing. Those death rates were considered acceptable business losses by Viking traders, factored into their profit calculations. Like modern companies account for product damage during shipping, dead slaves were simply tossed overboard like any other damaged cargo, often without ceremony or acknowledgement that they had been human beings with families, dreams, and lives that mattered. It's like Amazon calculating package loss rates, except the packages were people. The psychological impact on survivors was devastating and long-lasting. Many enslaved people who survived the ship journey never fully recovered from the trauma, developing what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. Medieval sources describe former slaves who remained terrified of water, refused to sleep in enclosed spaces, or had violent panic attacks at the sound of chains or rope creaking, symptoms that persisted for years after their ordeal ended. Even the Viking crews weren't immune to the psychological toll of this system. Several accounts describe Viking raiders who eventually refused to participate in slave transport, claiming the voyages gave them nightmares and made them question their entire way of life. Some converted to Christianity specifically to escape what they described as a cursed profession that was damaging their souls. It's like working in a job so morally toxic that it eventually breaks even the people who profit from it. The economic consequences rippled throughout medieval society in ways that shaped European development for centuries. Regions that lost large portions of their population to slave raids often never recovered their economic or military strength, while areas that received large numbers of enslaved people saw dramatic cultural and demographic changes that influenced everything from language, development to religious practices. The slave trade wasn't just individual tragedy, it was reshaping the entire map of medieval Europe through forced migration and cultural disruption. Meanwhile, the actual mechanics of how Vikings captured and processed their human cargo reveals an even darker aspect of this system: the industrial scale efficiency with which they turned raiding into a profitable business model. The ship transport was just one part of a larger operation that included intelligence gathering, target selection, and market analysis that would make modern corporations envious of their strategic planning capabilities. The Vikings didn't just randomly attack settlements hoping to find people to enslave. They developed sophisticated networks of information gathering, scouting operations, and advanced planning that allowed them to maximize their return on investment while minimizing their risks. It's like they were running the medieval equivalent of a market research company, except their research focused on identifying defenseless communities with valuable human resources and figuring out the most efficient ways to harvest those resources for profit. But the real horror wasn't just in the capture or the transport, it was in how this entire system became so normalized, so systematized, and so central to Viking society that it shaped their culture, their economics, and their relationships with the rest of medieval Europe in ways that most people today still don't fully understand. If the floating nightmare of slave ship transport was the horrific finale of the Viking human trafficking process, then the capture and procurement system was the terrifyingly efficient opening act that would make modern kidnapping operations look like amateur hour at a community theater. While the ships represented the logistical horror of moving human cargo across vast distances, the actual acquisition of that cargo was a masterpiece of strategic planning, psychological warfare, and systematic violence that combined the worst aspects of military invasion, corporate raiding, and organized crime. The Vikings didn't just wake up one morning and decide to go people shopping on a whim, like some kind of medieval impulse buying spree at the human equivalent of Costco. They developed sophisticated intelligence networks, advanced scouting operations, and target selection processes that would make modern military strategists and business consultants genuinely impressed by their thorough market research and operational planning. This wasn't random violence perpetrated by barbarians having bad days. It was systematic, organized hunting of human beings conducted with all the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company's acquisition department that the procurement process involved. Multiple specialized roles, seasonal timing considerations, geographic expertise, and risk assessment calculations that rival modern corporate strategic planning in their complexity and attention to detail. Viking raiding parties included scouts who had spent months gathering intelligence about potential targets, specialists in breaking defensive fortifications, experts in crowd control and human herding, and logistics coordinators responsible for managing the captured population during the return journey to the ships. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of Amazon's supply chain management. Except instead of optimizing the delivery of consumer goods, they were perfecting the acquisition and transport of terrified human beings. The entire system was designed to minimize Viking casualties while maximizing the quantity and quagga acquired, with backup plans, contingency strategies, and alternative targets identified in advance in case the primary operation encountered unexpected resistance. The psychological impact of this systematic approach was almost as devastating as the physical violence itself. Communities lived in constant fear not just of random attacks, but of carefully planned operations that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating efficiency, and disappear before any effective response could be organized. It's like living under the constant threat of being targeted by a criminal organization that has unlimited resources, perfect intelligence, and no moral constraints whatsoever on their methods or objectives. Consider the systematic destruction of the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 CE, which historians now recognize as essentially a beta test for the Viking human trafficking industry. The attack wasn't just about stealing gold chalices and fancy religious artifacts. It was a carefully planned operation designed to test their methods for capturing and processing large numbers of people who had no military training or defensive capabilities. The monks at Lindisfarne were basically sitting ducks, educated, valuable in slave markets due to their literacy, completely defenseless, and conveniently located on an island that could be easily accessed by ship while remaining isolated from any potential rescue operations. The Vikings spent weeks observing the monastery's daily routines, identifying the number of inhabitants, mapping escape routes, and timing their attack for maximum surprise and minimum resistance. They struck during morning prayers when all the monks were gathered in one location, effectively trapping their entire target population in a single building. It's like if modern criminals spent months studying a shopping mall's security patterns and customer flow, then timed their robbery for the exact moment when everyone would be gathered in the food court with no security guards in sight. But here's where the story gets really dark. The attack on Lindisfarne wasn't primarily about religious persecution or anti-Christian sentiment, as many historians originally assumed. Recent archaeological evidence and analysis of contemporary sources suggests it was fundamentally a business operation disguised as religious warfare. The Vikings discovered that educated monks commanded premium prices in Islamic slave markets, where literacy was highly valued and Christian slaves were considered exotic curiosities that demonstrated the OWNER's international connections and cultural sophistication. The operation at Lindisfarne was so successful that it became the template for hundreds of similar attacks throughout the British Isles and continental Europe. The Vikings had essentially figured out the medieval equivalent of a profitable business model and decided to franchise it across multiple markets. Monasteries became favorite targets not because of religious animosity, But because they offered high-value human inventory with minimal security investment required for acquisition. Another perfect example is the systematic targeting of Irish coastal settlements during the 830s and 840s. The Vikings established permanent bases on islands off the Irish coast, creating what were essentially forward operating bases for human trafficking operations. These weren't temporary raiding camps. They were sophisticated logistics hubs with holding facilities for captured people, repair facilities for ships, and coordination centers for planning multiple simultaneous operations across different regions. The Irish operations revealed the true industrial scale of Viking human trafficking. Historical records suggest that during peak raiding seasons, Viking bases in Ireland were processing thousands of enslaved people annually with regular ship convoys, transporting human cargo to markets in Scandinavia, the Baltic, and the Islamic world. They had developed assembly line efficiency for processing captured populations, initial sorting based on age and physical condition, temporary holding facilities while waiting for transport, and systematic documentation that would make modern human traffickers envious of their organizational capabilities. One particularly chilling account from the Annals of Ulster describes a raid on the settlement of Armagh, where Vikings captured over 700 people in a single operation. The attack was coordinated across multiple landing points simultaneously, effectively surrounding the entire community and preventing escape. Witnesses described the systematic way the raiders divided their captives into groups based on apparent market value: young adults for heavy labor, children for training as domestic servants, educated individuals for specialized work, and attractive women for what the sources euphemistically call household service. In wealthy Islamic households, the human sorting process was conducted with all the emotion and moral consideration of livestock evaluation at a cattle auction. Vikings had developed expertise in rapidly assessing the market value of human beings based on physical condition, estimated age, apparent social status, and potential specialized skills. They knew which slave markets preferred which types of people, and they tailored their procurement operations accordingly. Perhaps most disturbing is the account of Viking operations in the Slavic regions of Eastern Europe, where entire tribal groups were systematically depopulated through coordinated raiding campaigns that spanned multiple years. These weren't single attacks, but sustained operations designed to harvest the human population of entire regions, like some kind of medieval clear-cutting operation applied to people instead of forests. The Vikings would establish seasonal camps and methodically work through an area, capturing everyone they could find and leaving behind communities that were no longer viable as independent societies. The scale of these operations required sophisticated logistics support that included supply chains for feeding captives during processing, transportation networks for moving large groups of people across difficult terrain, and coordination between multiple raiding parties to prevent conflicts over territory or targets. It's like they were running the medieval equivalent of a major military campaign, except the objective wasn't conquering territory, it was harvesting the population. This systematic approach to human trafficking wasn't isolated to a few ambitious Viking entrepreneurs looking to make quick profits in emerging markets. The patterns of behavior were remarkably consistent across different regions, time periods, and raiding groups, suggesting that efficient human procurement techniques were being shared, refined, and standardized throughout Viking society like some kind of horrible professional development program for medieval kidnappers. The operational patterns reveal several key strategies that were employed consistently across the Viking world. First, the preference for coastal and river settlements that could be accessed directly by ship, allowing for rapid deployment of raiding forces and quick extraction with human cargo before local defenders could organize effective resistance. It's like they had identified the medieval equivalent of drive-through locations, places where they could conduct their business efficiently without getting bogged down in extended military engagements that would reduce profitability. Second, the systematic targeting of religious institutions, educational centers, and administrative locations where concentrated populations of valuable individuals could be found. Vikings quickly learned that attacking random farmsteads might yield a few captives, but attacking monasteries, schools, or government centers provided access to people with specialized skills who commanded higher prices in slave markets. They were essentially conducting targeted acquisitions of human capital, focusing on intellectual property theft, except the intellectual property consisted of actual people. Third, the development of seasonal raiding schedules that coordinated with agricultural cycles, weather patterns, and market demand in destination slave markets. Viking human trafficking operations weren't conducted randomly throughout the year. They were carefully timed to maximize success rates and profit margins. Spring and summer raids coincided with favorable sailing conditions and peak demand in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern markets, while winter months were used for planning, intelligence gathering, and maintenance of equipment and facilities. The geographic patterns also reveal sophisticated understanding of political weaknesses and defensive vulnerabilities across medieval Europe. Vikings consistently targeted regions experiencing political instability, succession disputes, or conflicts between local rulers that left populations without effective protection. They were like medieval vultures circling areas of political weakness, ready to exploit any opportunity that presented itself. Perhaps most chilling is the evidence for systematic cooperation between different Viking groups in coordinating large-scale operations. Rather than competing with each other for the same targets, many Viking leaders appear to have developed territorial agreements and resource sharing arrangements that maximized overall efficiency while minimizing conflicts that could reduce profits for everyone involved. It's like they had established the medieval equivalent of a criminal cartel with defined territories, shared intelligence, and coordinated pricing strategies. The consistency of these patterns across vast geographic areas and extended time periods suggests that Viking human trafficking had evolved from opportunistic raiding into a mature industry with established best practices, professional networks, and institutional knowledge that was passed down through generations of practitioners. What started as random acts of violence had become systematized criminal enterprise, operating on an international scale. The effects of this systematized human procurement industry were absolutely devastating and permanently altered the demographic, cultural, and political landscape of medieval Europe in ways that historians are still documenting and analyzing today. The immediate impact was the systematic depopulation of entire regions, particularly coastal areas and river valleys that were accessible to Viking ships. Some areas of Ireland, Scotland, and the English coast lost as much as 20 to 30% of their population to slave raids during the peak Viking period, creating demographic holes that took centuries to recover. But the long-term consequences were even more far-reaching and complex. The constant threat of Viking raids fundamentally changed how medieval European societies organized themselves, with communities abandoning coastal locations, investing heavily in defensive fortifications, and developing early warning systems that shaped settlement patterns for generations. It's like an entire continent reorganizing itself around the threat of systematic kidnapping operations, with all the economic and social disruption that such reorganization entailed. The economic effects rippled throughout medieval society in ways that shaped European development for centuries. Regions that lost large portions of their working-age population to slave raids often experienced economic collapse, agricultural decline, and political fragmentation that left them vulnerable to further exploitation. Meanwhile, the influx of Viking silver earned through slave trading created artificial economic booms in Scandinavia that funded further military expansion and technological development. The cultural impact was equally profound and disturbing. The systematic nature of Viking human trafficking created a climate of fear that influenced everything from religious practices to artistic expression. Medieval European literature from this period is filled with references to the terror of being captured and sold into slavery. And archaeological evidence suggests that many communities developed elaborate hiding places and escape routes specifically designed to evade slave raiders. Perhaps most tragically, the success of Viking human trafficking operations inspired imitation by other groups throughout medieval Europe. The profitable business model pioneered by the Vikings was eventually adopted by various other societies, creating a proliferation of human trafficking networks that made slavery a central feature of medieval European economics rather than a marginal activity. The social consequences included the breakdown of traditional community structures in heavily raided areas, as constant fear of capture made normal social activities dangerous and community gatherings potential targets for slave raiders. Some regions developed essentially militarized societies where every aspect of daily life was organized around defense against human trafficking operations. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors and their communities created generational patterns of fear, mistrust, and social dysfunction that persisted long after the Viking raids ended. Entire cultures developed around the memory of systematic enslavement, with stories, traditions, and social institutions designed to prevent or respond to future human trafficking threats. Yet even as this systematic procurement industry was reaching its peak efficiency and expanding into new markets across medieval Europe, the actual business of selling human cargo was revealing its own set of complexities, contradictions, and unexpected consequences that would ultimately reshape not just the slave trade itself, but the entire economic and political structure of the medieval world. The slave markets where these carefully procured human beings were ultimately sold operated according to their own brutal logic, with pricing mechanisms, quality standards, and customer preferences that would make modern economists both fascinated and horrified by their sophistication. The interaction between Viking suppliers and their diverse customer base across the Islamic world, Byzantine Empire, and various European kingdoms created a complex web of international relationships that influenced everything from diplomatic negotiations to religious conflicts. But perhaps most ironically, the very success of the Viking human trafficking industry began to create conditions that would eventually undermine the entire system. As the markets became saturated with enslaved people, competition increased between different supplier groups, and the political consequences of systematic human trafficking began to threaten the stability of the regions where it operated most successfully. By the mid-10th century, the Viking slave trade had reached what economists would recognize as a classic market saturation crisis, except instead of dealing with overproduced consumer goods gathering dust in warehouses, they were dealing with too many enslaved human beings flooding markets that couldn't absorb the supply. The situation had reached a breaking point that would make modern supply chain managers break out in stress-induced hives, just thinking about the logistics nightmare involved in managing thousands of unwilling human inventory across multiple international markets. The crisis wasn't just about numbers, though the scale was staggering enough to overwhelm even the most sophisticated medieval market systems. Viking traders were arriving at established slave markets in Constantinople, Cordoba, and Baghdad, with ship after ship of human cargo, only to discover that previous shipments hadn't been fully sold and that warehouse space, if you can call holding pens for enslaved people warehouses, was running critically low. It's like if Amazon's delivery trucks kept showing up with packages, but all the distribution centers were already packed beyond capacity, and nobody wanted to buy what was already there. The tensions involved multiple competing Viking groups who had all been operating under the assumption that demand for enslaved people was essentially unlimited, only to discover that even the wealthiest Islamic kingdoms and Byzantine nobles had limits on how many slaves they could actually use or afford to maintain. Different raiding crews were undercutting each other's prices, engaging in what amounted to medieval price wars over human beings, and creating diplomatic incidents when their aggressive sales tactics offended local customs or violated established trading protocols. The key players in this crisis included Rus merchants operating along the Volga trade route, who controlled access to the lucrative Eastern markets, Danish raiders who dominated the Western European procurement networks, Norwegian crews who specialized in the North Atlantic routes, and various Slavic intermediaries who had carved out profitable niches as middlemen in the human trafficking supply chain. Each group had invested heavily in ships, equipment, personnel, and established relationships with specific markets, and none of them were willing to voluntarily reduce their operations to accommodate the others. The stakes involved weren't just individual profit margins or trading relationships. The entire economic structure of Viking society had become dependent on slave trade revenues, with whole communities, political alliances, and military capabilities funded by the profits from human trafficking. Regional kings and jarls had borrowed against expected slave trade income to finance other ventures, and the sudden market instability threatened to create a cascading economic collapse that could destabilize Scandinavian politics for generations. Meanwhile, the markets themselves were experiencing their own internal crises as local authorities struggled to manage the social, economic, and political consequences of absorbing massive numbers of enslaved people from distant lands with different languages, religions, and cultural backgrounds. The crisis reached its dramatic peak during what contemporary sources call the Great Market Disruption of 960 CE, when three separate Viking fleets arrived simultaneously at the slave market in Constantinople, carrying a combined total of over 2,000 enslaved people, only to discover that the Byzantine economy was in recession. Demand for slaves had plummeted due to recent military defeats, and the market could realistically absorb maybe 200 people without completely crashing the local price structure. The situation began unfolding like a medieval version of a corporate merger gone horribly wrong. The first fleet to arrive was led by a Rus trader named Svinold, who had established relationships with Byzantine buyers over several years and was expecting to conduct business as usual. His ships carried approximately 800 enslaved people, mostly Slavic captives from recent raids along the Dnieper River, and he had already negotiated preliminary prices with local dealers based on previous transactions. Svinold's crew had barely begun unloading their human cargo when the second fleet appeared on the horizon, led by a Danish jarl named Erik Bloodaxe. And yes, that was actually his name, which should tell you something about his approach to conflict resolution. Erik's operation was larger and more aggressive, with over 1,000 enslaved people crammed into his ships, and he had no intention of waiting politely for Svinold to complete his sales before beginning his own negotiations. The tension escalated dramatically when Erik's men began setting up their own temporary holding areas right next to Svinold's operation, effectively creating competing slave markets in the same location. Byzantine buyers, recognizing an opportunity to leverage the competition for better prices, began playing the two Viking groups against each other, demanding lower costs and better terms, while threatening to take their business to whichever group offered the most favorable deals. But the situation truly exploded into chaos when the third fleet arrived, commanded by a Norwegian captain named Olaf the Stout, whose timing could not have been worse if he had deliberately planned to create maximum disruption. Olaf's ships carried another 400 enslaved people, and he had apparently received outdated intelligence about market conditions. because he immediately began loudly advertising his inventory and promising prices that were significantly below what the other two groups were offering. The confrontation that followed was like watching a medieval version of Black Friday shopping, except instead of fighting over discounted electronics, heavily armed Viking warriors were arguing about the wholesale pricing of human beings while their terrified captives watched from holding pens. Contemporary Byzantine sources describe the scene as resembling a marketplace designed by demons for the amusement of devils, which is pretty strong language coming from people who were accustomed to the casual brutality of medieval politics. The immediate trigger for violence came when Eric's men accused Svinhild's crew of deliberately spreading false information about market conditions to discourage competition, while Svinhild's people claimed that Eric had violated established protocols by arriving without proper advance notification to local authorities. Meanwhile, Olaf's crew was apparently oblivious to the brewing conflict and kept trying to conduct normal business negotiations while tensions escalated around them. The verbal arguments quickly escalated to shoving matches, then to drawn weapons, and finally to full-scale combat between the three groups right in the middle of the slave market, with hundreds of enslaved people chained nearby as unwilling witnesses to a battle being fought over the right to sell them. Byzantine guards initially tried to intervene to protect their city's commercial interests, but quickly withdrew when they realized they were vastly outnumbered by Vikings, who seemed perfectly willing to fight three separate battles simultaneously. The fumbled fighting continued for most of a day, with various Byzantine officials attempting to negotiate ceasefires while the three Viking groups took turns forming temporary alliances against whichever crew seemed to be gaining an advantage. At one point, Svinhild and Olaf apparently agreed to work together against Eric, only to immediately turn on each other when Eric's forces retreated to regroup. The battle finally ended when a fire broke out in one of the holding areas. Sources disagree about whether it was started accidentally during the fighting or deliberately set by enslaved people who saw an opportunity to escape in the chaos. The fire spread rapidly through the temporary wooden structures that housed the enslaved captives, forcing all three Viking groups to temporarily cease fighting and work together to prevent their valuable human inventory from being destroyed. The immediate aftermath was a scene of complete devastation that shocked even experienced Byzantine officials who were accustomed to the casual violence of medieval commerce. Dozens of Vikings had been killed or wounded. Much of the temporary infrastructure for the slave market had been destroyed, and an unknown number of enslaved people had either died in the fire or escaped during the confusion. Contemporary sources estimate that the three groups lost nearly half their human inventory to death, escape, or injury-related devaluation. But perhaps most significant was the realization by all parties involved that the traditional Viking approach to slave trading, showing up with large quantities of human cargo and expecting immediate sales, was no longer sustainable in increasingly sophisticated and saturated markets that required more careful planning, coordination, and respect for local business customs. The response to the Constantinople incident was swift and revealed just how dependent the entire medieval economic system had become on the smooth functioning of human trafficking networks. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII immediately issued new regulations requiring advance notification for all slave trading operations, mandatory inspections of human cargo for health and security risks, and licensing requirements for foreign traders that effectively gave the government veto power over who could participate in the slave market. More significantly, the emperor imposed a quota system that limited the number of enslaved people that could be brought to Constantinople in any given time period, essentially forcing Viking traders to coordinate their operations or risk being turned away entirely. It's like implementing surge pricing for human trafficking, except instead of paying more during peak demand, traders had to wait their turn or find alternative markets for their human inventory. The immediate economic consequences rippled throughout the Viking world faster than gossip in a small town. The sudden restriction of access to one of their most profitable markets forced Viking groups to compete more aggressively for access to alternative trading locations, driving down prices and profit margins across the entire slave trade network. Regional jarls, who had borrowed money against expected slave trade revenues, found themselves unable to meet their obligations, leading to a cascade of defaults that destabilized political alliances throughout Scandinavia. The political fallout was equally dramatic and long-lasting. The three groups involved in the Constantinople incident returned home with significantly reduced profits and damaged reputations, leading to internal conflicts within their respective communities. Svinel's crew faced accusations of incompetent planning from their investors. Eric's warriors blamed their leadership for poor intelligence gathering, and Olaf's people were criticized for their timing and lack of market awareness. Perhaps most ironically, the incident led to increased cooperation between Viking groups, who realized that their competitive approach was ultimately self-destructive. Several major raiding organizations formed what amounted to a medieval cartel, agreeing to coordinate their operations, share market intelligence, and avoid flooding individual markets with more human cargo than they could realistically absorb. The enslaved people who survived the incident faced their own complex consequences. Some who had escaped during the chaos were eventually recaptured and sold at reduced prices due to their flight risk designation, while others managed to disappear into Constantinople's complex urban environment. A few were eventually freed by Byzantine authorities who wanted to demonstrate their humanitarian concern following the international embarrassment of the market disruption. The longer-term impact included the development of more sophisticated market analysis and planning capabilities within Viking trading operations, the establishment of permanent representatives in major slave markets to monitor conditions and coordinate shipments, and the creation of financial instruments that allowed traders to hedge against market volatility and unexpected disruptions. This Constantinople incident wasn't just a business dispute that got out of hand. It revealed fundamental contradictions in the entire medieval slave trade system that had been building for decades, but had never been forced into the open so dramatically. The crisis demonstrated that the Viking model of human trafficking had become too successful for its own sustainability, creating a classic economic bubble that was bound to burst eventually. The incident showed that even the most brutal and efficient system of human exploitation had practical limits imposed by market forces, political realities, and the basic logistics of managing large numbers of unwilling human beings across vast distances. It's like discovering that even the most profitable criminal enterprise eventually faces the same business challenges as legitimate companies, except the consequences of market disruption involve human lives rather than just financial losses. More broadly, the crisis revealed how deeply integrated the slave trade had become in medieval international relations. The disruption affected diplomatic relationships between Viking kingdoms and their trading partners, influenced religious conflicts between Christian and Islamic societies, and shaped political alliances that would determine the course of European development for generations. The incident also demonstrated the agency and resistance of enslaved people themselves, who took advantage of the chaos to escape, resist, or disrupt their captors' operations in ways that their captors hadn't anticipated. The fire that ultimately ended the battle was likely set deliberately by people who recognized an opportunity to turn their captors' greed and violence against them. Most significantly, the Constantinople crisis marked the beginning of the end for the classic Viking slave trade model, forcing adaptations and innovations that would ultimately transform the entire system in ways that no one involved could have predicted or planned for. Around the main events of market crashes and floating prison ships, a fascinating cast of supporting Characters played crucial roles in keeping this medieval human trafficking industry running with all the efficiency of a well-oiled machine operated by people who had clearly never heard of workplace safety regulations or basic human decency. These weren't just random background players. They were specialized professionals who had carved out profitable niches in what was essentially the world's most morally bankrupt supply chain management system. Take Ingvar the Intermediary, a Swedish merchant who essentially invented the medieval equivalent of human resources management, except his job involved managing actual humans as resources rather than helping people find jobs they'd hate less than their current ones. Ingvar operated a network of temporary holding facilities along the Baltic coast where captured people could be sorted, evaluated, and prepared for specific markets based on demand forecasts and customer preferences. He developed what amounted to a medieval database of buyer preferences, tracking which Islamic nobles preferred educated slaves, which Byzantine merchants wanted skilled craftspeople, and which Slavic princes were looking for domestic servants who could cook specific regional cuisines. Ingvar's operation was so sophisticated that he employed interpreters who could communicate in over a dozen languages, medical evaluators who could assess the health and market value of potential slaves, and even what we might call today product preparation specialists who taught captured people basic phrases in Arabic or Greek to make them more appealing to buyers. It's like if someone created a finishing school for human trafficking victims, which is exactly as disturbing as it sounds, but was apparently considered good business practice in medieval Scandinavia. Then there was Astrid the accountant, one of the few women who managed to carve out a significant role in the Viking slave trade, primarily because she was better at mathematics than most of her male colleagues and could calculate profit margins, exchange rates, and inventory turnover with the precision of a modern financial analyst. Astrid managed the books for several major raiding operations, tracking everything from the initial costs of mounting expeditions to the final sale prices of individual enslaved people, and she apparently kept detailed records that would make modern tax auditors weep with professional envy. Astrid's ledgers, fragments of which have survived in archaeological contexts, reveal the cold mathematical reality behind the slave trade's emotional horror. She recorded people not by names, but by categories: young male, strong build, appears literate, or female, approximately 20 years, skilled in textile work, minor injuries. Her accounting methods treated human beings exactly like livestock inventory, with depreciation schedules for aging captives, loss projections for transport mortality, and profit optimization strategies that maximize return on investment while minimizing operational costs. Perhaps most bizarrely, there was Thorvald, the therapist, a Norwegian who specialized in what medieval sources euphemistically call preparing captives for their new circumstances. Thorvald had developed techniques for breaking down enslaved people's resistance and psychological defenses, essentially creating medieval Stockholm Syndrome through a combination of calculated kindness, strategic cruelty, and psychological manipulation that would make modern cult leaders take notes. His methods were so effective that he was regularly hired by other Viking crews to process particularly valuable or resistant captives. Thorvald's approach involved isolating newly captured people from others who spoke their language, providing small comforts and privileges to those who showed compliance, and gradually introducing the idea that cooperation with their captors was their only path to survival and potentially even eventual freedom. It's like if someone had weaponized therapy techniques for the purpose of making human trafficking more efficient, which is probably one of the most disturbing job descriptions in medieval history. On the other side of the operation were characters like Mohammed the Broker, an Islamic merchant who served as the primary intermediary between Viking suppliers and Middle Eastern buyers. Muhammad operated out of Constantinople and maintained detailed intelligence networks that tracked political developments, economic conditions, and cultural preferences across the Islamic world. He could predict which regions would have increased demand for slaves based on military campaigns, harvest failures, or changes in local leadership. And he provided this market intelligence to Viking traders in exchange for preferential pricing and exclusive access to certain types of captives. Muhammad's operation reveals how international and sophisticated the slave trade had become by the 10th century. He maintained correspondence with buyers in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, tracking their specific requirements and coordinating deliveries across vast distances with timing precision that would impress modern logistics companies. His records show orders for specific types of people. 50 young men for agricultural work must be healthy and accustomed to heavy labor, or 12 educated women for household management, preferably with knowledge of textile production. These weren't isolated individual entrepreneurs operating in competitive isolation. They formed complex webs of relationships, partnerships, and mutual dependencies that created what amounted to a medieval criminal enterprise with international reach and sophisticated coordination capabilities. The connections between these various players reveal just how systematic and organized the slave trade had become by its peak period. Ingvar's sorting facilities, for example, were directly connected to Astrid's financial networks through shared investment partnerships where multiple Viking crews would pool their resources to fund larger expeditions with higher potential returns. Astrid would calculate the optimal crew sizes, target locations, and timing for raids based on Ingvar's market intelligence about current demand and Muhammad's reports about political conditions in destination markets. It's like they had created the medieval equivalent of a venture capital fund specializing in human trafficking investments. The relationship between Thorvald's psychological manipulation services and Muhammad's brokerage operation was particularly sophisticated and disturbing. Muhammad would provide Thorvald with detailed information about the cultural backgrounds and expectations of ultimate buyers, allowing Thorvald to tailor his preparation techniques to make captives more appealing to specific markets. For example, enslaved people destined for Islamic households would be taught basic Arabic phrases and Islamic customs, while those headed for Byzantine buyers would learn Greek greetings and Christian prayers. One particularly well-documented example involves a coordinated operation from 954 CE, where these various specialists worked together to fulfill a specific large order from a wealthy Abbasid governor who wanted to establish a new household in Baghdad. Muhammad had negotiated a contract for 200 enslaved people with specific qualifications: 50 skilled craftspeople, 50 agricultural workers, 50 domestic servants, and 50 guards and personal attendants. Each category had detailed specifications regarding age, physical condition, skills, and even personality traits. Astrid calculated that fulfilling this order would require raiding at least a dozen different settlements to acquire the right mix of people, and she developed a detailed budget that included costs for ships, weapons, provisions, and compensation for crew members. Ingvar coordinated the logistics of targeting specific types of communities that would yield the required demographics, while Thorvald planned the psychological processing procedures needed to prepare such a large and diverse group for their eventual roles. The operation took nearly 2 years to complete and involved raids across Ireland, Scotland, the Slavic territories, and even some Germanic regions. The coordination required to maintain quality standards, manage such a large number of captives during extended processing periods, and deliver the final product according to contract specifications demonstrates a level of organizational sophistication that rivals modern corporate project management. But the interconnections went beyond simple business partnerships. Many of these specialists had family relationships or long-term personal bonds that created additional layers of trust and cooperation within the slave trade network. Ingvar and Astrid were apparently cousins whose families had been involved in Viking raiding for generations, while Thorvald had trained several apprentices who established their own operations in different regions, creating a professional network of psychological manipulation specialists. The relationships also extended to corruption and influence peddling within legitimate political and religious institutions. Several of these slave trade specialists maintained connections with Christian monasteries, Islamic courts, and Byzantine administrative offices that provided them with advanced intelligence about political developments, military campaigns, and economic opportunities that could affect their business operations. For example, Muhammad's network included contacts within the Abbasid bureaucracy who would inform him about upcoming military campaigns that might create demand for slave soldiers, or about political purges that might put wealthy families in the market for new household staff to replace those who had fallen from favor. Similarly, Ingvar had developed relationships with corrupt monks who would provide information about the wealth and defenses of other monasteries in exchange for protection from raids or shares in the profits from attacks on their competitors. These interconnected relationships created a self-reinforcing system where success in one area generated opportunities and resources that could be leveraged in other areas. The slave trade wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It had become a shadow economy that paralleled and sometimes influenced legitimate medieval political and economic institutions through corruption, intimidation, and the strategic application of wealth generated through human trafficking. To understand how these elaborate human trafficking networks could operate so openly and successfully, you have to understand the cultural context of medieval society, where the line between legitimate business and organized crime was often determined more by social status and political connections than by moral considerations or legal restrictions. The medieval world didn't have clearly defined concepts of human rights, international law, or universal moral standards that applied across different cultures and political systems. Daily life in Viking society was organized around the assumption that raiding and warfare were normal, legitimate activities for young men seeking to establish their reputations and acquire wealth. The capture and sale of enemies wasn't considered morally different from any other form of acquiring and trading valuable goods. It was just another type of business activity that required specific skills and carried certain risks. It's like if modern society treated armed robbery as a legitimate career path for ambitious young people, complete with professional development opportunities and industry best practices. The beliefs and attitudes that made this system possible were deeply embedded in Norse religious and cultural traditions that emphasize personal honor, military prowess, and the acquisition of wealth as measures of individual worth and social status. The Norse pantheon included gods who were themselves involved in conflicts, betrayals, and morally ambiguous activities, providing religious justification for behavior that other cultures might consider criminal or immoral. Social structures in Viking society were based on personal loyalty relationships between leaders and followers, where success in raiding and warfare was one of the primary ways that ambitious individuals could advance their social status and acquire the resources needed to attract followers and establish their own households. The slave trade provided opportunities for social mobility that didn't exist in the more rigid class systems of other medieval societies. What was considered normal behavior in Viking society would have been shocking to outsiders. But what's equally important to understand is that other medieval cultures had their own moral blind spots and acceptance of practices that we would consider abhorrent today. Byzantine society accepted slavery as a normal part of economic life. Islamic societies had elaborate legal frameworks governing the treatment and trading of enslaved people. And Christian Europe was simultaneously condemning Viking raids while participating enthusiastically in the slave markets that those raids supplied. The cultural normalcy of slavery across medieval societies meant that the Viking slave trade was operating within a broader context where human trafficking was considered legitimate business activity rather than criminal enterprise. The moral outrage that modern people feel about slavery simply didn't exist in the same way during the medieval period, when most societies accepted the enslavement of foreigners, enemies, or people from different religious backgrounds as natural and morally acceptable. Even the religious opposition to slavery that did exist was often limited to protecting members of one's own faith community, rather than establishing universal principles of human dignity and freedom. Christian monks might condemn the enslavement of Christians by pagan Vikings, but they had fewer moral qualms about Christians enslaving pagans, Muslims, or members of heretical Christian sects. Perhaps most ironic about this entire system was how the Vikings' very success at human trafficking eventually created the conditions that would undermine their own society and ultimately contribute to the end of the Viking Age itself. The massive influx of wealth from slave trading funded military expeditions, political ambitions, and lifestyle changes that gradually transformed Viking society from a collection of relatively simple agricultural communities into complex political entities that required different skills and priorities than those that had made them successful raiders. The contradictions get even weirder when you consider that many of the most successful Viking slave traders eventually became respected members of medieval European nobility through strategic marriages, religious conversions, and political alliances. That allowed them to transition from criminal enterprises to legitimate political authority. It's like if modern organized crime bosses could eventually become senators or governors, simply by changing their religious affiliation and marrying into established political families. Some of the most successful former slave traders became enthusiastic supporters of Christian missionary activities and anti-slavery legislation, apparently experiencing genuine religious conversions that led them to condemn the very activities that had made them wealthy and powerful. The psychological transformation required to go from systematically trafficking human beings to advocating for their protection suggests either remarkable personal growth or remarkable hypocrisy, depending on your perspective. Even more ironically, some former Viking slave traders used their wealth and political connections to fund military campaigns against other Viking groups who were still engaged in slave trading, essentially becoming the enforcers of new moral standards that they themselves had violated for decades. The former criminals became the law enforcement officers, which created a bizarre situation where the most effective opponents of Viking slave trading were often people who understood the business intimately because they had been running it themselves. The ultimate irony is that the Viking slave trade was so successful that it contributed to the political and economic development of medieval Europe in ways that eventually made Viking-style raiding obsolete and impractical. The wealth generated by human trafficking funded the development of stronger defensive capabilities, more sophisticated political institutions, and international cooperation agreements that gradually reduced the opportunities for the kind of systematic raiding that had made the slave trade possible in the first place. The Vikings had essentially built a business model so successful that it created the conditions for its own obsolescence. Like creating a product so popular that it saturates the market and eliminates demand for itself. Everything changed when Christianity began spreading through Scandinavia like a software update that nobody asked for, but everyone eventually had to install whether they liked it or not. The religious transformation wasn't just about personal spiritual beliefs or theological debates. Among scholars, it fundamentally altered the economic, social, and moral framework that had made the Viking slave trade possible and profitable for over 2 centuries. It's like if your entire business model suddenly became illegal overnight, except instead of government regulations. The change was driven by a combination of religious conviction, political pressure, and a gradual realization that maybe treating other humans like livestock wasn't the best foundation for building a sustainable civilization. The background to this change was a complex mix of factors that had been building for decades, but reached critical mass during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The political landscape of medieval Europe was shifting as stronger centralized kingdoms emerged, making traditional Viking raiding increasingly difficult and dangerous. Meanwhile, the economic benefits of legitimate trade were becoming more apparent as Scandinavian societies developed more sophisticated agricultural and manufacturing capabilities that could generate wealth without requiring military expeditions to kidnap people from other countries. But perhaps most importantly, the success of the slave trade itself had created unintended consequences that were beginning to undermine the very foundations of Viking society. The massive influx of wealth from human trafficking had created social stratification, political complexity, and international relationships that required different skills and approaches than those that had made Vikings successful raiders. It's like a startup company that grows so fast that it can no longer operate with the same informal, chaotic methods that made it successful in the first place. This moment was different from previous challenges to the slave trade because it represented a fundamental shift in values rather than just practical obstacles or market disruptions. Earlier problems had been essentially business challenges, market saturation, competition between Viking groups, or diplomatic complications with trading partners. The Christian transformation represented a complete rejection of the moral assumptions that had justified human trafficking as legitimate economic activity. The key factors that led to this transformation included the conversion of major Scandinavian rulers who used their political authority to discourage or prohibit slave trading, the influence of Christian missionaries who provided alternative moral frameworks for understanding human relationships, and the practical recognition that participation in Christian, European political networks required abandoning practices that other Christian societies found morally unacceptable. The religious change also coincided with economic developments that made legitimate trade more profitable than raiding. Scandinavian societies were developing exportable goods like amber, furs, and metalwork that could generate substantial wealth through peaceful commerce, while the risks and costs associated with slave raiding were increasing as potential targets improved their defensive capabilities and international cooperation against Viking activities became more effective. The shift wasn't sudden or uniform across all Viking societies. Different regions and communities adopted Christianity at different rates and with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some areas continued practicing traditional religions and engaging in slave trading for decades after others had converted, creating internal conflicts and political tensions that further destabilized the old system. It's like trying to update a computer network where some machines are running the new software while others are still operating on the old system. Except the incompatibility issues involve fundamental questions about human rights and moral behavior, rather than just technical problems. The transformation unfolded like the world's most consequential corporate restructuring program. Except instead of reorganizing departments and updating job descriptions, entire societies were fundamentally changing their economic models, social structures, and moral frameworks while trying to maintain political stability and avoid complete chaos during the transition period. The change process was messy, inconsistent, and full of setbacks that would have made modern change management consultants reach for stronger coffee and update their resumes. Resistance to the change came from multiple directions and for various reasons that had little to do with religious conviction, and everything to do with economic self-interest and social status. The most obvious opposition came from Viking crews and leaders whose entire wealth, power, and social identity were tied to the slave trade. These weren't people who could easily transition to alternative careers. Their skills, relationships, and resources were specifically adapted to a particular type of criminal enterprise that was becoming socially and politically unacceptable. Imagine trying to convince a successful organized crime family that they should abandon their traditional business model and open a legitimate restaurant instead. Even if they accept the moral arguments, they still have to deal with practical questions like what to do with their existing inventory, how to pay off their debts, and whether their skill set in intimidation and violence translates well to customer service and food preparation. The champions of change included newly converted Christian rulers who saw opposition to slavery as a way to demonstrate their religious commitment and gain acceptance from other European Christian kingdoms. King Olav Tryggvason of Norway became particularly enthusiastic about suppressing slave trading, partly out of genuine religious conviction and partly because he recognized that continued participation in human trafficking was damaging Norway's relationships with powerful Christian neighbors who could provide military and economic support. But the most effective advocates for change were often former slaves who had managed to gain their freedom and acquire positions of influence within Scandinavian society. These individuals had first-hand knowledge of the slave trade's operations and could provide detailed information about how to disrupt the networks while also serving as living examples of the human potential that was being wasted through enslavement. It's like having former victims of a criminal enterprise become the prosecutors and investigators working to shut down the operation. The specific steps in the transformation process involve both top-down policy changes and bottom-up social pressure that gradually made slave trading less profitable and more dangerous. Christian rulers began imposing legal penalties for participating in slave raids, while Christian communities started boycotting traders who dealt in human cargo. Churches provided alternative economic opportunities for young men who might otherwise have joined raiding expeditions, while Christian merchants offered legitimate trading partnerships that could generate wealth without requiring violence or kidnapping. The obstacles encountered during this transition were substantial and sometimes violent. Some Viking groups responded to the changing political environment by increasing their raiding activities, trying to maximize profits before the opportunities disappeared entirely. Others attempted to adapt their operations by focusing on non-Christian targets or moving their activities to regions where Christian influence was weaker. One of the most significant breakthrough moments came when several major slave trading organizations voluntarily disbanded and used their wealth to fund Christian missionary activities and charitable works that specifically focused on freeing enslaved people and providing them with support for rebuilding their lives. It's like if modern organized crime syndicates decided to become humanitarian relief organizations, using their expertise in logistics and international operations to deliver aid rather than contraband. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces in driving this change is complex and debatable. Some historians emphasize the importance of specific rulers and religious leaders who made decisive policy choices that accelerated the transformation, while others argue that the change was inevitable due to broader economic and political trends that made the old system unsustainable regardless of individual decisions. What's clear is that the change required both institutional support from political and religious authorities and grassroots acceptance from ordinary people who had to be convinced that abandoning a profitable traditional practice was worth the economic and social costs involved. The transformation succeeded because it offered alternative pathways to wealth, status, and social mobility that didn't require participating in morally questionable activities. The process also involved significant international cooperation, as Christian European kingdoms worked together to suppress Viking slave trading through diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and coordinated military responses to continued raiding activities. This represented one of the earliest examples of international cooperation to combat human trafficking. Though the motivations were as much political and economic as they were humanitarian, the new system that emerged from this transformation was fundamentally different in its economic structure, social organization, and moral framework, creating what amounted to a completely different civilization that happened to be populated by the descendants of people who had previously made their living through systematic human trafficking. The changes weren't just superficial modifications to existing practices. They represented a complete reorganization of how Scandinavian societies generated wealth, organized political relationships, and understood their place in the broader medieval world. The economic transformation was particularly dramatic and comprehensive. Instead of basing their prosperity on raiding and slave trading, Scandinavian kingdoms developed sophisticated trading networks that exchanged legitimate goods like amber, furs, metalwork, and wooden products for foreign luxuries, raw materials, and finished goods. The transition required developing new skills in manufacturing, quality control, customer service, and international diplomacy that were completely different from the abilities needed for successful human trafficking operations. The new economic model was actually more profitable in the long run than slave trading had been, though it required more patience, cooperation, and investment in infrastructure and education. Legitimate trade relationships provided more stable and predictable income streams than raiding, while also creating positive relationships with trading partners who could provide military and political support during conflicts with other kingdoms. The social changes were equally significant and far-reaching. The old Viking society had been organized around warrior culture and personal loyalty relationships that emphasized individual prowess in combat and the ability to acquire wealth through violence. The new Christian Scandinavian societies developed more complex social structures that valued different types of achievement, including scholarly learning, artistic creation, diplomatic skill, and commercial success through peaceful means. The transformation also created new opportunities for social mobility that weren't based on military success or participation in criminal enterprises. People could advance their social status through education, religious devotion, artistic talent, or business acumen, rather than having to prove themselves through their willingness to participate in raids and their effectiveness at capturing and selling other human beings. The new rules and norms that governed these transformed societies included legal codes that explicitly prohibited slave trading and provided penalties for participating in human trafficking, religious institutions that promoted concepts of universal human dignity and moral behavior, and political structures that emphasized cooperation with other Christian kingdoms rather than competition through military aggression. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals the complexity of this historical transformation. Some aspects of Scandinavian culture, including their expertise in shipbuilding, navigation, and long-distance travel, remain valuable and important in the new system, while others, particularly their tolerance for violence and their casual attitude toward the suffering of outsiders, had to be fundamentally altered or abandoned entirely. The maritime skills that had made Vikings effective raiders proved equally valuable for legitimate trading expeditions, while their knowledge of international markets and cultural differences gave them significant advantages in developing commercial relationships across medieval Europe. However, their approach to conflict resolution, their understanding of social relationships, and their moral framework had to be completely rebuilt around Christian principles and legal institutions. The geographic knowledge and navigational expertise that Vikings had developed through centuries of raiding expeditions became the foundation for trading. Networks that connected Scandinavia with markets throughout Europe, the Middle East, and even Asia. Former raiders became merchants, explorers, and diplomats who used their knowledge of foreign languages and customs to build peaceful relationships rather than to identify vulnerable targets for attack. The transformation was so complete that within a few generations, Scandinavian societies had developed into some of medieval Europe's most prosperous and politically sophisticated kingdoms, with legal systems, educational institutions, and cultural achievements that rivaled those of any other region. The descendants of slave traders had become respected members of the international community. Was this transformation ultimately positive or negative? From almost any reasonable moral perspective, the answer seems obvious: ending systematic human trafficking and replacing it with legitimate economic activities was clearly an improvement for humanity in general and for the potential victims of slave trading in particular. The change eliminated enormous amounts of human suffering while creating more stable, prosperous, and morally defensible societies in Scandinavia. But the evaluation becomes more complex when you consider the different perspectives and timeframes involved in assessing historical change. From the perspective of Viking warriors and traders whose livelihoods depended on slave trading, the transformation represented economic catastrophe and social upheaval that destroyed traditional ways of life and forced painful adaptations to new systems they didn't necessarily understand or appreciate. The short-term effects included economic disruption, political instability, and cultural conflict as different groups within Scandinavian society struggled to adapt to new expectations and opportunities. Some communities experienced significant hardship during the transition period, while others prospered by successfully adapting to the new economic and social environment. The long-term effects were overwhelmingly positive in terms of human welfare, economic development, and political stability. The transformed Scandinavian societies became major contributors to medieval European civilization, with achievements in law, literature, architecture, and governance that influenced the development of modern European institutions and values. However, it's worth noting that the end of Viking slave trading didn't eliminate slavery from medieval Europe. It simply shifted the trade to other groups and regions. The moral victory was real, but incomplete, and the broader problem of human trafficking continued in different forms for centuries afterward. The contemporary judgment of this change by people living through it was mixed and complicated by their limited perspective on long-term consequences. Modern historical judgment tends to be more uniformly positive, though historians continue to debate the specific causes, mechanisms, and alternative possibilities that might have produced different outcomes. In the years and decades that followed the collapse of the Viking slave trade, Scandinavian society experienced what historians now recognize as one of the most dramatic economic and cultural transformations in medieval European history. Like watching a criminal organization successfully rebrand itself as a legitimate multinational corporation while somehow maintaining all of its logistical expertise, but completely changing its product, line, and customer service philosophy. The transition wasn't smooth or immediate. It took generations for the full implications of abandoning human trafficking to work their way through every aspect of Norse society. The new challenges that emerged were both predictable and surprisingly complex. Former slave traders had to figure out how to apply their skills in logistics, international relations, and risk management to legitimate business activities, which turned out to be more difficult than simply changing the cargo from people to goods. The psychological adjustment from viewing foreigners as potential inventory to seeing them as potential customers and business partners required fundamental shifts in thinking that many former Vikings never fully completed. the evolution of the mental shifts to Vikrude. Situation created entirely new social and economic dynamics that nobody had anticipated during the initial transformation period. Scandinavian kingdoms found themselves with extensive knowledge of international markets, well-established transportation networks, and detailed understanding of foreign cultures. But they had to completely rebuild their reputation in the international community while learning to operate within legal and moral frameworks that their predecessors had systematically ignored for centuries. That second-generation effects included the development of some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated trading operations, as former Viking routes and contacts were converted to legitimate commercial purposes. The same geographical knowledge that had made Vikings effective raiders proved invaluable for establishing peaceful trade relationships, while their maritime technology and navigational expertise gave them significant competitive advantages in the emerging medieval economy. However, the transformation also created unexpected social problems as communities struggled to find new sources of identity, purpose, and economic opportunity for young men who had previously been channeled into raiding expeditions. Some regions experienced increased internal violence and social unrest as the traditional outlets for aggressive behavior were eliminated, without adequate replacement activities being immediately available. The former slave trading infrastructure had to be completely repurposed or abandoned, creating both opportunities and challenges for communities that had built their entire economic base around human trafficking. Some coastal settlements that had served as processing centers for enslaved people successfully transitioned to become legitimate trading ports, while others simply disappeared as their economic foundation vanished and their populations migrated to areas with better opportunities. Perhaps most significantly, the end of the slave trade forced Scandinavian societies to develop new forms of international diplomacy and cooperation that were based on mutual benefit rather than intimidation and exploitation. This required learning entirely new skills in negotiation, treaty making, and conflict resolution that emphasized compromise and long-term relationship building rather than immediate gain through violence. The cultural adjustment was equally challenging and comprehensive. Scandinavian societies had to develop new mythology, literature, and social customs that celebrated different types of heroism and achievement than those that had been valued during the Viking Age. The transition from warrior culture to merchant culture required fundamental changes in how people understood success, honor, and social status that took generations to fully implement and accept. The transformed post-Viking world attracted entirely new types of leaders, institutions, and cultural influences that would have been impossible or unthinkable during the height of the slave trading period. These new players brought different skills, values, and approaches that fundamentally altered how Scandinavian societies operated and related to the broader medieval world, like replacing a company's entire management team with people who had completely different professional backgrounds and moral frameworks. The most significant new figures were Christian rulers who had genuinely internalized religious values rather than simply converting for political convenience. Leaders like King Olaf II of Norway, later Saint Olaf, represented a completely different model of kingship that emphasized moral leadership, legal reform, and the protection of vulnerable populations rather than military conquest and wealth acquisition through violence. These rulers had to learn how to maintain political authority and social stability without relying on the traditional Viking methods of intimidation and reward through successful raiding. Their roles and contributions were fundamentally different from their predecessors because they had to create legitimacy through entirely new means. Instead of proving their worthiness through successful military campaigns and profitable slave raids, Christian Scandinavian rulers had to demonstrate their effectiveness through legal reforms, economic development, diplomatic achievements, and religious devotion. It's like expecting someone who had built their career as a professional fighter to suddenly become a therapist. The skills and mindset required are almost completely opposite. How these new leaders differed from earlier players reveals the magnitude of the cultural transformation that had occurred. Viking jarls and war chiefs had been essentially successful criminal entrepreneurs, whose authority came from their ability to organize profitable illegal activities and distribute the proceeds among their followers. Christian kings had to base their authority on completely different foundations, including their relationship with religious institutions, their effectiveness at promoting legitimate economic development, and their ability to maintain peaceful relationships with neighboring kingdoms. The specific stories about these new elements often highlight the dramatic contrast with the previous era. King Magnus I of Norway, for example, used the wealth and international contacts that his predecessors had developed through slave trading to establish some of medieval Europe's most important educational institutions and charitable organizations. The same networks that had once transported enslaved people across vast distances were converted to support scholarly exchange, religious pilgrimage, and humanitarian aid for people affected by famines, wars, and natural disasters. Their contributions to the ongoing narrative were both practical and symbolic. These new leaders had to prove that legitimate Christian governance could be as effective at generating prosperity and maintaining social order as the old Viking system had been at creating wealth through violence and exploitation. Their success or failure would determine whether the transformation away from slave trading would be permanent or whether Scandinavian societies would eventually revert to their previous practices. The emergence of new institutional players was equally significant and transformative. Christian monasteries and schools became major centers of economic activity and social influence, replacing the traditional warrior halls and raiding camps as the focal points of community life. These institutions brought completely different values and priorities that emphasized education, artistic creation, and spiritual development rather than military training and preparation for criminal expeditions. New types of merchants and traders emerged who specialized in legitimate commerce and had no background or interest in the slave trade. These individuals often came from other parts of Europe and brought different business practices, legal traditions, and moral frameworks that further accelerated the transformation of Scandinavian commercial culture. Their presence created competitive pressure on former Vikings to adapt their practices to meet the standards and expectations of the broader European trading community. The new players also included former slaves, who had remained in Scandinavia after gaining their freedom and had become productive members of society. Their experiences and perspectives provided valuable insights into the human costs of the previous system, while also demonstrating the potential for peaceful integration and cooperation between different cultural groups. But some problems persisted. Despite the religious transformation and the official end of large-scale slave trading, because changing laws and social norms doesn't immediately eliminate the underlying economic incentives, cultural attitudes, and practical knowledge that had made human trafficking profitable and socially acceptable for centuries. The legacy issues were like trying to completely remove a computer virus that had infected every aspect of the system, even after the main program was deleted. Remnants continued to cause problems in unexpected ways. Continuing challenges included the persistence of small-scale slave trading operations that adapted to the new environment by becoming more secretive, more selective about their targets, and more careful about their marketing and distribution methods. Some former Vikings essentially went underground, maintaining their human trafficking activities while presenting themselves as legitimate merchants or political authorities. It's like how organized crime adapts to increased law enforcement by becoming more sophisticated rather than simply abandoning their criminal activities. What didn't get resolved was the fundamental problem that slavery remained legal and socially acceptable in many of the markets where Scandinavian slave traders had previously sold their human cargo. The demand for enslaved people in the Islamic world, the Byzantine Empire, and various parts of Christian Europe didn't disappear just because the Vikings had stopped supplying that market. Other groups quickly moved to fill the supply gap, including Slavic traders, Italian merchants, and various criminal organizations that adopted and refined the methods that Vikings had developed. New versions of old problems emerged as some of the former Viking slave trading networks were converted to other types of human trafficking that remained legal and profitable. The transition from enslaving captured enemies to recruiting voluntary workers for extremely dangerous or unpleasant jobs created gray areas, where the line between legitimate employment and exploitative labor practices became difficult to define or enforce. Cyclical patterns developed where periods of strict enforcement against slave trading alternated with periods of relaxed oversight when political attention was focused on other issues or when economic pressures created incentives to ignore violations of anti-slavery laws. Some regions experienced periodic revivals of slave trading activities during times of political instability, economic crisis, or military conflict when normal legal and social controls broke down. Why certain issues proved intractable had to do with the deep structural factors that had made the slave trade attractive in the first place. The basic economic reality that human labor had significant value and that some people were willing to use violence to acquire and control that labor didn't change just because the legal and moral frameworks had been altered. The knowledge, skills, and relationships that have made Viking slave trading successful were still present in the population and could be reactivated under the right circumstances. The international nature of the slave trade also made it difficult to eliminate completely through changes in any single region or culture. Even if Scandinavian societies completely abandoned human trafficking, the practice continued in other areas and could potentially resurface in Scandinavia if conditions changed or if new groups moved into the region with different moral standards and legal traditions. Perhaps most problematically, many of the social and economic structures that had supported the slave trade were simply repurposed rather than eliminated. The same social networks that had coordinated raiding expeditions could be used to organize other types of criminal activities, while the international contacts and transportation capabilities that had made slave trading possible could be applied to smuggling, piracy, or other forms of exploitation that fell short of outright enslavement but still caused significant human suffering. The persistence of underlying attitudes and assumptions about the relative value of different types of people also created ongoing vulnerabilities. Even among converted Christians, prejudices based on ethnicity, religion, social class, and cultural background continued to influence how people were treated and what rights they were accorded, creating opportunities for exploitation that stopped just short of formal slavery. Compared to earlier periods in Scandinavian history, the post-slave trade era represented such a dramatic transformation that it's almost like comparing two completely different civilizations that happen to occupy the same geographic territory and share some genetic continuity. The differences in values, economic systems, political structures, and international relationships were so fundamental that former Vikings and their Christian descendants might have had difficulty recognizing each other as members of the same cultural tradition. When measured against other places during the same time period, the Scandinavian transformation was relatively unusual and impressive in its scope and rapidity. Most medieval European societies evolved more gradually and with less dramatic changes in their fundamental economic and social structures. The Viking transition from systematic human trafficking to legitimate Christian kingdoms happened faster and more completely than similar transformations in other regions. partly because the old system had become so clearly unsustainable, and partly because the new Christian framework provided such a clear, alternative model for organizing society. What was unique about the Scandinavian experience was the combination of external pressure from Christian neighbors, internal religious conversion, and practical recognition that legitimate trade could be more profitable than raiding. Most other societies that abandoned slavery or slave trading did so more gradually and often under different circumstances that didn't require such comprehensive social and economic reorganization. What was universal about the Scandinavian transformation was the basic human capacity for moral growth and social adaptation when provided with appropriate incentives and alternative opportunities. The same psychological and social factors that had made Vikings effective at human trafficking, including their organizational skills, risk tolerance, and ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances, proved equally valuable for building legitimate trading, networks, and diplomatic relationships. The lessons that could be learned from the Viking experience include the importance of providing alternative economic opportunities when trying to eliminate harmful traditional practices, the value of combining moral persuasion with practical incentives for change, and the need for international cooperation when addressing criminal activities that cross national and cultural boundaries, patterns that repeated elsewhere in medieval Europe included the tendency for criminal organizations to adapt to changing legal and social environments rather than simply disappearing. The importance of religious and moral frameworks in providing justification for major social changes, and the role of economic development in creating alternatives to exploitative traditional practices. The Scandinavian transformation also demonstrated that even societies with deeply embedded traditions of violence and exploitation could successfully transition to more peaceful and cooperative models when presented with appropriate motivation and support. This suggests that similar transformations might be possible in other contexts where harmful traditional practices are supported by economic incentives and social structures that could potentially be modified or replaced. However, the Viking experience also showed that such transformations require sustained effort over multiple generations, and that the underlying knowledge and capabilities that enabled harmful practices don't simply disappear, but must be actively redirected toward constructive purposes to prevent their eventual return to destructive uses. By the late 11th century, clear signs pointed to the complete end of the Viking Age and its associated slave trading industry, though many of the key players seemed remarkably oblivious to the writing on the wall, like middle managers at Blockbuster in 2005, who kept insisting that streaming video was just a passing fad and that people would always prefer driving to stores to rent physical DVDs. The warning signs were everywhere for anyone willing to see them. But the human capacity for denial, when your entire livelihood depends on ignoring inconvenient truths, is truly remarkable across all historical periods. The most obvious indicators included the systematic strengthening of defenses throughout medieval Europe as potential target communities learned from centuries of Viking raids and invested heavily in fortifications, early warning systems, and coordinated military responses that made traditional raiding increasingly costly and dangerous. It's like if all the houses in a neighborhood suddenly installed security systems, hired private guards, and formed a neighborhood watch program specifically designed to catch burglars. Eventually, even the most skilled criminals would start looking for easier targets or alternative career paths. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the complex psychology of people whose entire identity and economic security was tied to a system that was clearly becoming obsolete. Some Viking leaders recognized that the old ways were no longer sustainable and began actively transitioning their operations toward legitimate trade and political alliances. Others doubled down on traditional raiding, convinced that they could divert overcome the new challenges through increased violence and more sophisticated planning. The resistance to inevitable change was particularly strong among older Viking leaders who had built their entire careers around slave trading and couldn't imagine alternative sources of wealth, status, or social identity. For these individuals, abandoning the slave trade wasn't just an economic decision. It was essentially a form of professional and personal suicide that would eliminate everything that had given their lives meaning and purpose. Many of the warning signs were cultural and religious rather than purely military or economic. The spread of Christianity throughout Scandinavia was accompanied by new legal codes, social institutions, and moral frameworks that explicitly condemned slave trading and provided alternative models for organizing society. Churches offered different pathways to social advancement and community, leadership that didn't require violence or criminal activity. The changing international political environment also created new pressures and opportunities that made the old Viking model increasingly impractical. The emergence of stronger centralized kingdoms throughout Europe meant that successful raiding required confronting more sophisticated and better organized military forces, while the development of international legal and diplomatic institutions created new costs and risks for societies that continued to engage in systematic human trafficking. Perhaps most significantly, the economic landscape was shifting in ways that made legitimate trade more profitable than raiding for most Scandinavian communities. The development of new agricultural techniques, manufacturing capabilities, and natural resource exploitation created domestic sources of wealth that didn't require military expeditions to acquire human cargo from foreign territories. The demographic changes within Scandinavian society also contributed to the transformation, as population growth and improved living standards reduced the economic pressures that had originally motivated many young men to join raiding expeditions. When people can make decent livings at home through legitimate activities, the appeal of dangerous criminal enterprises tends to diminish significantly, unless the potential rewards are extraordinarily high compared to the available alternatives. The Viking Age didn't end with a single dramatic battle or political decision, but rather faded away through a series of increasingly futile attempts to maintain traditional raiding practices in a world that had fundamentally changed around them. Like watching the last video rental store in America slowly going out of business as streaming services made their entire business model obsolete. The final major Viking slave trading operations of the late 11th and early 12th centuries were characterized more by desperation than by the confident efficiency that had marked the peak period of Norse human trafficking. The specific events that marked the transition were often anticlimactic and sad rather than dramatically heroic. The last major slave raid recorded in contemporary sources occurred in 1103, when a Norwegian crew led by Magnus Barefoot attempted to revive the traditional practice by attacking settlements in Ireland and Scotland. The expedition was a complete disaster that demonstrated how thoroughly the world had changed since the peak Viking period. Magnus's raiding party encountered well-prepared defenses, coordinated resistance from multiple communities, and immediate retaliation from local authorities who had developed sophisticated methods for tracking and punishing raiders. The expedition lost most of its ships, suffered heavy casualties, and managed to capture only a few dozen people who proved impossible to sell because the traditional slave markets had either disappeared or developed new suppliers who offered better prices and more reliable service. The final major players in the declining slave trade were often desperate, incompetent, or both, bearing little resemblance to the skilled criminal entrepreneurs who had built the industry during its peak period. These last-generation Viking raiders were like the final generation of horse and buggy manufacturers who refused to accept that automobiles represented the future of transportation, technically competent at their traditional skills, but completely unable to adapt to changed circumstances. The last attempts to preserve or revive the old system were particularly pathetic and revealed how completely the underlying conditions had changed. Some former slave traders tried to rebrand their activities as legitimate military recruitment or labor contracting, offering their services to various European rulers who needed soldiers or workers for specific projects. These ventures typically failed because the former Vikings lacked the diplomatic skills, legal knowledge, and moral credibility required for legitimate business operations. Other final efforts involved attempting to establish new slave trading operations in more distant regions where Christian influence was weaker and traditional defenses were less developed. Some Norwegian and Danish expeditions tried to revive the eastern routes through Russia toward the Islamic world, but discovered that Slavic intermediaries had taken over these networks and had no interest in sharing the business with Scandinavian competitors who brought nothing new to the table. The dramatic final moments of the Viking slave trade were often absurdly anticlimactic, like watching a once feared criminal organization reduced to petty theft and small-time scams. The final recorded attempt at a traditional Viking slave raid occurred in 1117, when a crew of aging Danish warriors attacked a monastery in northern England, only to discover that the monks had been expecting them, had hidden anything valuable, and had arranged for local military forces to surround the raiders before they could return to their ships. The symbolic endpoints of the Viking Age are disputed among historians, but most agree that the death of Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 marked the end of Viking military effectiveness, while the last recorded slave trading expedition in 1117 represented the final attempt to maintain the economic systems that had supported Viking society for centuries. By 1150, the transformation was essentially complete. The descendants of Viking slave traders had become Christian merchants, nobles, and scholars who were deeply integrated into medieval European political and economic networks. The ships that had once transported enslaved people across the North Atlantic were being used for legitimate trade, exploration, and pilgrimage. The same navigational skills and maritime technology that had made Vikings effective raiders were now being applied to peaceful purposes that contributed to rather than undermined the stability and prosperity of medieval European civilization. The last Viking slave ship probably rotted away in some forgotten harbor, its chains and holding pens gradually deteriorating as the wood returned to the earth, leaving behind only archaeological traces of what had once been one of medieval Europe's most profitable and morally destructive industries. The analysis of what caused the final collapse of the Viking slave trade reveals a complex interaction of internal problems, external pressures, and broader historical forces that made the continuation of traditional Norse human trafficking practices impossible. Regardless of how determined individual Vikings might have been to preserve their ancestral criminal enterprises, it's like trying to figure out why the Roman Empire fell. There were so many contributing factors that historians still debate which ones were most important and whether the outcome was inevitable or could have been prevented through different decisions. The internal problems that undermined the slave trade from within included the systematic conversion of Scandinavian societies to Christianity, which provided both moral arguments against human trafficking and alternative economic opportunities. That made raiding less attractive to potential participants. The religious transformation wasn't just about personal beliefs. It fundamentally altered the social structures, legal systems, and cultural values that had made slave trading socially acceptable and economically profitable. The generational change within Viking society also played a crucial role, as young men who had grown up in increasingly Christian and prosperous communities were less motivated to join dangerous criminal expeditions when they could achieve wealth and status through legitimate means. The children and grandchildren of successful slave traders often became merchants, scholars, or political leaders who had no interest in continuing their families' traditional criminal activities. External pressures included the systematic improvement of defenses throughout potential target regions, as communities that had been repeatedly victimized by Viking raids invested heavily in fortifications, military training, and early warning systems that made traditional raiding methods increasingly costly and dangerous. The development of coordinated international responses to Viking activities also created new risks for raiders who could no longer count on escaping to safety before organized retaliation could be mounted. The economic environment had also changed in ways that made legitimate trade more profitable than raiding for most Scandinavian communities. The development of new technologies, agricultural improvements, and natural resource exploitation created domestic sources of wealth that didn't require military expeditions to foreign territories. Meanwhile, the costs and risks associated with slave raiding had increased dramatically as potential targets became better defended, and the international political consequences of continued human trafficking became more severe. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending the Viking slave trade is complex and debatable. Some historians emphasize the importance of specific rulers like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf II, who made decisive policy choices to suppress slave trading and promote Christian values. Others argue that the transformation was driven by broader economic and political trends that would have ended the Viking Age regardless of individual decisions by particular leaders. What could have been done differently to potentially preserve the Viking slave trade system is a disturbing but historically interesting question. More effective adaptation to changing circumstances, better international coordination among Viking groups, or more sophisticated methods for avoiding Christian influence might have prolonged the slave trade for additional decades or even centuries. However, the fundamental economic and political trends that were undermining the system were probably too powerful to be overcome through purely tactical adjustments. The question of inevitability versus contingency in historical change is particularly relevant to understanding why the Viking slave trade ended when and how it did. While the specific timing and mechanisms of the transformation were influenced by particular decisions and events, the broader forces that made the old system unsustainable, including technological development, political centralization, religious change, and economic evolution, were probably too powerful to be permanently resisted through any realistic modifications to Viking practices or strategies. The end of the Viking slave trade represents one of history's more successful examples of the elimination of a major criminal industry through a combination of moral persuasion, economic development, political pressure, and cultural transformation. The immediate aftermath of the Viking Age's end was characterized by a complex mixture of relief, nostalgia, and uncertainty as Scandinavian societies struggled to define their new identity and role in medieval European civilization without the criminal enterprises that had previously provided them with wealth, international influence, and cultural distinctiveness. It's like watching a company try to rebrand itself after its core product line becomes illegal. There's a lot of confusion about what to do with existing resources and how to maintain market position while completely changing the business model. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the disappearance of Viking slave traders reveals the international nature of medieval human trafficking networks and the unfortunate reality that eliminating one source of enslaved people doesn't necessarily reduce overall demand or supply. Italian merchants, particularly from Venice and Genoa, quickly expanded their existing slave trading operations to fill some of the gap left by the Vikings, while Slavic intermediaries took over much of the Eastern European trade that had previously been dominated by Norse raiders. The short-term consequences for Scandinavian societies included economic disruption, as communities that had depended on slave trade revenues had to develop alternative sources of income. Political instability, as traditional leadership structures based on successful raiding were replaced by new forms of authority based on Christian kingship and legitimate commerce. And cultural identity crises, as societies struggled to maintain their distinctiveness while abandoning the practices that had made them famous throughout medieval Europe. Contemporary reactions to the end of the Viking Age were mixed and revealed the complex attitudes that medieval people had toward violence, exploitation, and social change. Many potential victims of Viking raids were obviously relieved that the threat had diminished, while some Scandinavians mourned the loss of their traditional way of life and the adventures, wealth, and social mobility that successful raiding had provided for ambitious young men. The attempts at revival or continuation of Viking practices were generally unsuccessful and often pathetic, as former raiders tried to maintain their traditional activities in a world that had fundamentally changed around them. Some groups attempted to establish new raiding bases in more distant regions, while others tried to adapt their skills to legitimate military service or commercial activities with varying degrees of success. The immediate legacy also included the preservation of Viking maritime technology, navigational knowledge, and cultural traditions that would influence Scandinavian development for centuries, even as the criminal applications of these capabilities were abandoned in favor of peaceful and productive uses that contributed to rather than undermined medieval European civilization. The legacy of the Viking slave trade shaped later European development in ways that most people today don't realize, influencing everything from genetic patterns to political institutions to economic systems in a ripple effect that continued for centuries after the last slave ship rotted away in some forgotten Scandinavian harbor. It's like discovering that a company that went out of business decades ago actually created the foundational technologies and business practices that still dominate an entire industry today. Except instead of talking about positive innovations, we're discussing the long-term consequences of systematic human trafficking on a continental scale. The specific influences on later developments were both direct and indirect, obvious and subtle. Obvious and subtle. The maritime technology and navigational expertise that Vikings had developed for slave trading expeditions became the foundation for legitimate exploration and commerce that connected Europe with Asia, Africa, and eventually the Americas. Same ships that had once transported terrified captives across the North Atlantic were redesigned and improved to carry merchants, pilgrims, and eventually colonists to new lands. It's like repurposing military drones for package delivery. The underlying technology remains valuable even when applied to completely different and more benign purposes. How later generations viewed the Viking slave trade reveals the complex ways that societies deal with uncomfortable aspects of their historical heritage. Medieval Christian chroniclers generally condemned Viking raiding while simultaneously admiring Viking maritime skills and military prowess, creating a romanticized narrative that emphasized adventure and heroism while downplaying or ignoring the systematic human trafficking that had actually motivated most Viking expeditions. The myths versus realities that developed around Viking history became increasingly disconnected from the actual historical record as later generations found it easier to celebrate heroic warriors seeking glory in battle than to acknowledge that their ancestors had primarily been criminal entrepreneurs specializing in kidnapping and human trafficking. The horned helmet stereotype, the noble warrior seeking entrance to Valhalla, and the democratic thing assemblies became popular cultural images that obscured the less appealing reality of Viking society's dependence on enslaving other people. Why? The Viking slave trade remained important or was forgotten in different contexts, depended largely on political and cultural factors that had little to do with historical accuracy. Scandinavian societies during their nation-building periods in the 18th and 19th centuries preferred to emphasize the military prowess and exploratory achievements of their Viking ancestors while conveniently forgetting about the human trafficking aspects that didn't fit with emerging national identities based on democratic values and moral progress. The influence on legal and political development was particularly significant and long-lasting. The international cooperation that had been necessary to suppress Viking slave trading became a model for later efforts to combat piracy, regulate international commerce, and establish diplomatic protocols for dealing with criminal activities that crossed national boundaries. Some historians argue that the anti-Viking coalitions of the 11th century represented some of the earliest examples of international law enforcement cooperation in European history. The economic legacy was equally important and complex. The wealth that had been generated through slave trading had funded infrastructure development, technological innovation, and cultural achievements throughout Scandinavia that continued to benefit these societies long after the human trafficking had ended. Churches, schools, and political institutions that had been built with slave trade profits became foundations for legitimate economic and social development that lasted for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the Viking slave trade had permanently altered the demographic and cultural composition of medieval Europe through the forced migration of hundreds of thousands of people across vast distances. The genetic and cultural mixing that resulted from this massive human trafficking operation influenced language development, religious practices, artistic traditions, and social customs in ways that shaped European civilization for generations. It's like discovering that a significant portion of your family tree was created through criminal activity, but that the resulting cultural and genetic heritage became a permanent and indelible part of who you are as a person and a society. Today, we can see echoes of the Viking slave trade in disturbingly numerous modern examples of human trafficking, organized crime, and systematic exploitation that operate with many of the same methods, motivations, and moral blind spots that characterized medieval Norse criminal enterprises. The technologies have changed, but the fundamental human dynamics that make large-scale exploitation possible remain depressingly consistent across historical periods, like software updates that change the user interface but leave the underlying programming essentially unchanged. The specific parallels between Viking slave trading and modern human trafficking are so numerous and detailed that they sometimes seem like someone copied the medieval playbook and simply updated it with contemporary technology and communications methods. Modern traffickers use the same systematic approaches to target selection, focusing on vulnerable populations with limited defensive capabilities, just as Vikings preferred to raid monasteries and isolated settlements that couldn't mount effective resistance. The intelligence gathering and advanced planning that modern criminal organizations use to identify and exploit their targets mirrors the sophisticated scouting and coordination networks that Vikings developed to maximize their success rates while minimizing their risks. Contemporary human traffickers invest significant time and resources in studying potential victims, local law enforcement capabilities, and market conditions before launching their operations, just as Viking crews spend months gathering information about target communities and timing their raids for maximum effectiveness. What hasn't changed about human nature across the centuries is the disturbing ease with which some people can rationalize and systematize the exploitation of others when the economic incentives are sufficiently attractive and the social costs are externalized to victims who lack political power or social standing. Modern human trafficking operations demonstrate the same psychological patterns that allowed Vikings to treat enslaved people as inventory rather than human beings, including dehumanization of victims, compartmentalization of moral responsibility, and the creation of professional cultures that normalize criminal behavior. The similar patterns in different contexts reveal universal aspects of how criminal enterprises develop, operate, and adapt to changing circumstances. Modern drug cartels, for example, display many of the same organizational characteristics as Viking raiding groups, including flexible leadership structures, profit-sharing arrangements among participants, territorial disputes with competing organizations, and the systematic use of violence to maintain control over markets and supply chains. The international nature of modern human trafficking also mirrors the Viking model, with criminal organizations operating across multiple jurisdictions, exploiting differences in legal systems and law enforcement capabilities, and maintaining complex networks of suppliers, transporters, and distributors who often have little direct contact with each other. It's like observing the same business model being implemented in different industries, across different historical periods. The specific products and technologies change, but the underlying organizational principles remain remarkably consistent. Lessons for contemporary issues include the recognition that effective responses to systematic human exploitation require coordinated international cooperation, long-term commitment to addressing underlying economic and social conditions that create vulnerability, and comprehensive approaches that combine law enforcement, prevention, victim support, and demand reduction strategies. The Viking slave trade was ultimately eliminated not through any single intervention, but through a combination of moral transformation, economic development, political pressure, and cultural change that made the entire system unsustainable. Modern parallels also extend to the rationalization strategies that people use to justify or ignore systematic exploitation when it provides them with economic benefits or competitive advantages. The medieval European consumers who purchased enslaved people from Viking traders were remarkably similar to modern consumers, who knowingly or unknowingly support industries that rely on forced labor, child labor, or other forms of exploitation to provide cheap goods and services. The role of technology in enabling both historical and contemporary forms of human trafficking reveals how innovations that have legitimate and beneficial applications can be adapted and misused by criminal organizations. Vikings used advances in shipbuilding and navigation to expand their trafficking operations, just as modern criminals use the internet, encrypted communications, and international financial systems to coordinate and conceal their activities. Perhaps most disturbingly, the modern parallels include the tendency for societies to romanticize or minimize historical forms of exploitation, while simultaneously condemning contemporary versions of the same basic practices. The popular fascination with Viking culture and history often glosses over or ignores the human trafficking aspects, just as modern consumers often prefer not to think too deeply about the supply chains that provide them with cheap clothing, electronics, and agricultural products. Even now, the Viking slave trade continues to influence multiple areas of modern life and thought in ways that most people don't recognize or acknowledge, creating ongoing connections between medieval criminal enterprises and contemporary institutions, practices, and attitudes that shape how we understand human rights, international law, economic development, and cultural identity in the 21st century. Academic study of the Viking slave trade has become increasingly sophisticated and morally complex as historians struggle to balance scholarly objectivity with ethical considerations about how to research, interpret, and present information about systematic human trafficking without inadvertently romanticizing or minimizing the human costs involved. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed disturbing details about the scale and efficiency of Viking human trafficking operations, forcing historians to completely revise their understanding of medieval Scandinavian society and its relationship With the rest of Europe, the influence on popular culture remains problematic and revealing of contemporary attitudes toward historical violence and exploitation. Movies, television shows, video games, and literature about Vikings typically emphasize adventure, warfare, and exploration while systematically ignoring or minimizing the human, trafficking aspects that actually motivated most Viking expeditions. This selective memory reveals uncomfortable truths about how modern societies prefer to remember historical criminal enterprises when they're associated with cultures that are now considered part of their heritage. Political discourse about immigration, refugee rights, and human trafficking often references historical precedents without acknowledging the complex ways that past and present forms of forced migration are connected. The Viking slave trade created patterns of population movement, cultural mixing, and social disruption that influenced European development for centuries. But these historical experiences are rarely discussed in contemporary debates about migration, policy, or refugee protection. Social movements focused on combating modern human trafficking sometimes draw inspiration from historical examples of successful efforts to eliminate systematic exploitation, though they often oversimplify the complex factors that made the transformation of Viking society possible. The end of the Viking slave trade required fundamental changes in religious beliefs, economic systems, political structures, and cultural values that took generations to fully implement and aren't easily replicated in different historical contexts. Why people still care about the Viking slave trade often has more to do with contemporary concerns about human rights, criminal justice, and social responsibility than with genuine historical interest. The Viking example provides a case study of how systematic criminal enterprises can be eliminated through comprehensive social transformation, but it also demonstrates how difficult and time-consuming such changes can be, and how easily societies can develop selective amnesia about uncomfortable aspects of their historical heritage. Looking back across this dark chapter of medieval history, we've seen how a systematic criminal enterprise evolved from opportunistic raiding into a sophisticated international business that shaped European civilization for centuries, before ultimately transforming into something entirely different and more humane through a combination of moral awakening, economic development, and political pressure that proves human societies can fundamentally change their values and practices, even when those changes require abandoning profitable traditional activities. The key patterns that emerge throughout our exploration reveal disturbing consistencies in how criminal organizations develop, operate, and adapt to changing circumstances, while also demonstrating the human capacity for moral growth and social transformation when provided with appropriate incentives and alternative opportunities. The Viking slave trade wasn't just a historical curiosity or an isolated example of medieval brutality. It was a comprehensive system that combined military efficiency, business acumen, and moral blindness in ways that created enormous human suffering while generating substantial wealth and political power for its practitioners. The most surprising discoveries in this journey include the sophisticated level of organization and international coordination that characterized Viking human trafficking operations. The complex psychological and social factors that allowed ordinary people to participate in systematic exploitation of other human beings, and the remarkable speed and completeness with which Scandinavian societies were able to abandon their criminal traditions and transform themselves into legitimate Christian kingdoms. Perhaps most important among our takeaways is the recognition that even the most brutal and seemingly entrenched systems of human exploitation can be eliminated through comprehensive social transformation, though such changes require sustained effort across multiple generations and the convergence of moral, economic, and political factors that make the old system unsustainable while providing viable alternatives.